Well, if you haven't heard yet, Boeing is a complete disaster. It's a company that has lost money now for 3 years in a row. They've been caught using dish soap for lubricant and hotel key cards to test fittings in planes, and situations at Boeing over the past few years, especially with the initial 737 MAX program, have led to the deaths of hundreds of people, partly due to poor training manuals and iPad training videos that weren't actually properly implemented by airlines, whether it was Boeing's fault or airlines' fault. We have no idea, but what is going on at Boeing is a disaster, so much so that all of a sudden a whistleblower who retired from Boeing in 2017 has just been found dead with an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head and a gun in his hand with a note in the other hand. Now, obviously, the police department in Charleston, North Charleston, in the area where this death occurred in a Holiday Inn parking lot, has suggested they're quite aware of the suspicions around this case, but have still not provided any details as to, did he actually have any gunshot residue on his hand? If he shot himself, we should be able to see gunshot residue on his hand around the area outside your palm where you'd be holding a gun. We should be able to tell these things if they had a proper crime scene. We should be able to know from ballistics, which that might take a little longer, if he actually held the gun at an angle that he could have comfortably or would have comfortably held. Sometimes when somebody else holds the gun for you, the gun would be in such an angle that you'd be shooting yourself in a weird angle like this or whatever. Very kind of gruesome and bad, but that's extremely uncomfortable for yours. These are things that can be discovered. So hopefully the police department is working on it, because this is really sus. And it's probably sus because, frankly, when you look at a company like Boeing, the company's had a really long history of, well, the stock basically going down. This is a company that has basically hit a low in COVID of about $89. It is up from there, but boy, it's been suffering, as you can see here on the week chart. It's really had a hard time. I mean, outside of COVID, yes, you got the recovery to about 180. It's had a hard time staying in the 200s, regularly bouncing back down into the 180-ish range. And so now the question is, what is going on at this company? Well, let's talk a little bit about John Barnett and potentially how Boeing compares to a company like Toyota. It's a good comparison to make here. First, John Barnett, the guy who killed himself, had, quote unquote, had some choice things to say for Boeing. We're going to go ahead and play that first. After we play that, we're going to jump into what we think about how Boeing compares to Toyota.
One, this is not a 737 problem. It's a Boeing problem. And I know the FAA's gone in and they've done due diligence and inspections to assure that the door plugs of the 737 are installed properly and the fasteners are torqued properly. But my concern is, what's the rest of the airplane? What's the rest of the condition of the airplane? And the reason my concern for that is, back in 2012, Boeing started removing inspection operations off their jobs. So it left the mechanics to buy off their own work. So what we're seeing with the door plug blowout is what I've seen with the rest of the airplane, as far as jobs not being completed properly, inspection steps being removed, issues being ignored. My concerns are with the 737 and the 787, because those programs have really embraced the theory that quality is overhead and non-value added. So those two programs have really put a strong effort into removing quality from the process. When I first started working at Charleston, I was in charge with pushing back defects to our suppliers. And what that meant was I'd take a group of inspectors and actually go to the supplier and inspect their product before they sent it in. Well, I'd taken a team of 4 inspectors to Spirit Aerosystems to inspect the 41 section before they sent it to Charleston. And we found 300 defects. Some of them were significant that needed engineering intervention. When I returned to Charleston, my senior manager told me we had found too many defects and he was going to take the next trip. So the next trip he went on, he took 2 of my inspectors. And when they got back, they were given accolades for only finding 50 defects. So I pulled that inspector aside and I said, did Spirit really clean up their act that quick? That don't sound right. And she was mad. She said, no, said the two inspectors were given 2 hours to inspect the whole 41 section and they were kicked off the airplane. One, this is not a 737.
That was a TMZ interview with John Barnett just days before he died. What's worth noting is that the 41 section is just the nose of the plane to just aft of the cockpit windows. That's wild. So they were given 2 hours to inspect that section, found 300 issues, and then they were kicked off. Later, when his team was invited back to Boeing for a follow-up inspection, he specifically wasn't invited, but somebody else from his team was forced to go rather than him, and then they magically only found 50 issues. Somehow the other 250 were resolved. And I guess if you're given a checklist, they could be cleared off, but then it also makes you wonder, were they, if they're being inspected by a different person who didn't see what it was like before? And so this really begs the question of what's going on at Boeing. Is this a culture of manufacturing problems? And again, how does it compare to Toyota? So first, my understanding of the Boeing bolt disaster, which was sort of foreshadowed by Mr. Barnett's complaints and whistleblowing about Boeing. Remember when we had a mid-air door plug blowout because bolts were missing? Well, my understanding, based on some of the latest evidence that's come out around these missing bolts, basically conclude that someone, let's call it at stage C of the production process, noticed missing bolts, but the bolts were the remaining piece of getting that plane moved from, let's say, production stage C to D. And so the entire assembly line has to pause and wait for those bolts to show up, which means all the other planes in the line behind slow down, slowing down production, slowing down potential profit at Boeing, which is already a money-losing company. That's a problem. So what do? Well, what they generally do is they'll say, all right, we're going to move the plane to the next phase anyway, and then we'll come back and fix the problem. This is called traveled work. This is a phenomenon where basically, okay, we need to go back and put the bolts in. Work travels to the next stage of production. The issue is if somebody doesn't document the issue and actually cohesively connect the different stages of production, the people at stage D might put panels on and go, cool, we're doing our part, never know that there was an issue from stage C. And if the C folks don't properly communicate it, what happens? Well, you end up with a plane that's got big old defects to the point where door plugs just go flying out midair. Now, that's a really big problem, and it's a sign that maybe Boeing is much more interested in getting planes off the line than actually getting quality out the door. This is what we just heard John Barnett allude to. He actually made it pretty clear that Boeing believes that quality is just a form of overhead. In other words, another way of saying there's more cost. So what can we do to just get more planes out the door rather than worrying about quality? But that's a problem when it comes to air travel, because you're playing with people's lives for dollars, and that's wrong. Now, Boeing has been trying to address this, and they've since announced that 60% of worker bonuses will be based on reducing traveled work. And this is where I think Toyota has a very interesting example of how they kind of solve and prevent these sort of quality issues. And when people think about Toyota, they usually think high-quality vehicles. So how can Toyota manufacture so well when American manufacturing like Boeing can fail so miserably? Well, Toyota had this principle called the Andon Cord, and it was basically something that was popularized in Japanese manufacturing, where somebody could essentially pull on a cord, shut down the entire production line. A supervisor would come and go, hey, what's wrong? We're going to make sure your issue gets solved. And somebody else, like a supervisor, is actually able to take responsibility for the issue, and the entire team sort of works to try to solve that problem as soon as possible to get the rest of the line moving again. And rather than making somebody feel bad for stalling production, they actually encourage it, and everybody works together to solve the issue. Whereas in sort of the more American manufacturing systems, you have much more, oh, come on, why are you stalling the production line? Move it along, let's go, we'll fix it later. And this fix it later mentality has actually left a lot of Boeings sitting out on tarmacs in what's called the flight line. This is essentially a parking lot where planes go waiting to get delivered. They take off and they go deliver them somewhere. They make their delivery flight. But how are you supposed to fix a plane outside in the flight line when all the ladders and the tools and the ergonomic workstations are located inside the facilities? Well, this is where oftentimes things either get missed or they get done poorly, and that's a big problem. All of my citations, by the way, for this are all over at ehack.com, where I post my commentary for free for you to read anytime you'd like, or of course you could always listen to it here on video. Now, the FAA just spent and concluded 6 weeks investigating Boeing, and they found, quote, a non-compliance issues in Boeing's manufacturing process controls, parts handling, and storage. And some of the examples they found were hotel key cards being used to check door seals, no manufacturer specifications or installation specifications suggesting you're supposed to use door key cards to check seal fits, and Dawn dish soap apparently being used to lubricate a door seal during installation. Weird. And then when Boeing was testifying before Congress, people were asked, Boeing was asked, do you have camera footage of who was working on these door plugs? Who was there? Oh, no, sorry, those cameras were set to auto-delete. This is like a culture of a disaster here, where it's like, move it along. We're a money-losing company. We got to appease the shareholders. We got to go make money. We got to get our bonuses. Got to get our buybacks going for the stock. And what do you end up with? Junky stuff like soap and hotel cards being used in installation processes, a lot of traveled work, nobody going back to fix the traveled work. In fact, it's so bad that when this Boeing 737 MAX 9 had its door plug blown off, Alaska Airlines went back and looked at their logs, and they were actually getting warnings on these on this particular plane. They actually specifically grounded the plane to essentially one part of the United States where it would just conduct shorter flights rather than long haul flights, and it would stay above land because they were already getting warnings that something was wrong with the plane and they needed to go in for detailed inspections. I guess some passengers complaining about whistling noises, which could have been an indication about the pressure issue from the first place, from the get-go, weren't enough. Clearly people were designed not to sit by that door plug, which is the sad thing. That kind of suggests Alaska knew about this Boeing problem, but somehow either via Boeing or because of Alaska's failure decided to fly anyway. Brett, I remember interviewing him, and Brett from ARK Invest, he's like, there's like a 1 in 400 chance that no one would be sitting next to that door plug that blew off. Somebody knew that there was a problem with this plane, and sure enough, there was. But apparently we have this aviation culture in America, at least thanks to Boeing, and apparently that might extend over to Spirit Aerosystems, which has had some issues, and maybe even Alaska Airlines. Apparently it's okay to just keep floating around with some of these known issues going around. In fact, just weeks before the 737 MAX incident, the specific plane that had its door plug blow off spent nearly 3 weeks, quote, shuffling down an assembly line with faulty rivets in need of repair. Oops. And so now you've got this John Barnett guy who's testifying in a federal whistleblower lawsuit. There are specific whistleblower procedures with the FAA if you're an employee and you have insight into aviation safety. And so he's testifying in a deposition. He's in the midst of his deposition, staying at this Holiday Inn hotel, and he's citing that he, while working at Boeing, had uncovered serious problems with oxygen systems, where maybe only 1 in 4, or rather, I should say, where only 3 in 4 breathing masks would actually work. In other words, 1 in 4. So 25% of people might end up holding down breathing masks that wouldn't actually work in an emergency. That's disgusting. And Barnett suggests that said it's not the 737 that was the only problem, but it's also the 787 Dreamliner, which is a long-haul flight based plane or styled plane. And he called both of these ticking time bombs. Scary. Really bad. So obviously you heard it from him himself, and then this idea that he could just end up dead doesn't actually prevent more suspicion here. If anything, it just creates more suspicion over Boeing's. I remember back flying on a 737 MAX, and I asked one of the stewardesses about it. This was pre-COVID. I asked, hey, don't you ever get people who are nervous about flying on the MAX? And she said, Oh, all the time. We actually take the little safety briefing card and we turn it around so it doesn't really clearly at the top left say 737 MAX. So they turn the branding around because the reputation is so bad. That was all back when they had the Ethiopian Air crashes for the stabilizer controls where pilots were mistrained, as we talked about at the beginning of the video, for a new system that they added in the 737 MAX. You had to kind of like rotate some wheel or whatever to overtake this system in the event of a failure, and two substantially deadly accidents. A lot of nasty problems related to Boeing. Yet despite all of these nasty problems related to Boeing, what's remarkable is this. Tesla has still managed to outperform Boeing year to date in its underperformance. RIP. In Boeing's earnings call, they basically express that they're confident in their recovery. And then when you look at their actual income, they have narrowed their operating loss from operations here at $773 million in 2023. But we expect now with these early 2024 issues, we might end up having even more losses at this particular company. So quite scary to see what's going on in the world of aviation. And I'm really sussed out that you could whistleblow a company in America and just like the spy movies, just end up dead. I thought that was for the movies. Yikes.